Chapter 6. Vicki spent all day Saturday watching out the window and looking up every time she heard a sound. Barbara laughed at her as she finished watering the garden. He said 5:30. It's only 2:30. I know. But I want to see him. Yesterday would be good. Barbara shook her head. I never thought you would be so in love that you couldn't do your chores. Vicki made a face at her sister, but her words made her think. Was she in love with John? She was definitely in lust with him, and she couldn't wait to be married, but was that just the lust, or was it because she was in love with him? She shook her head, refusing to dwell on it. John made her smile, and that was the most important thing in her eyes. After the garden, she went inside to make supper. The dance was a potluck, as were all the meals in the community. It was her job to take enough to feed her family, and everyone would get whatever they wanted. She decided to make a pot pie. If no one else would eat it, then Bastion Appleby would surely eat the whole thing. The man couldn't seem to live unless he had pie every day of his life, which amused Vicki a great deal. She decided to make 2 pies. One would be a pot pie with chicken, and the other apple. Abby Appleby had been on a quest to can all the apples in the world last fall, and thankfully, she'd shared several jars of pie filling with her. Vicki was certain Bastion was still upset that he had to make do with fewer pies that year. Vicki made both pies and put them both in the oven, sitting down at the table for a moment. It had been her first time sitting in hours. Her wedding plans were coming together, though she hadn't confirmed a date yet. In a way, she wished it could just be her and John with the pastor, speaking their vows, but she knew her mother wanted to be there this time. When Roy and Emma had each had their weddings, they'd been brief with no family there. That seemed the best way to Vicki, but she knew her ma regretted the busy time they'd both married in. She'd wanted to be there to see her children marry. She'd do as her ma wanted, as much as she wished things could be different. It would all be fine. Vicki went into the parlor to check on her ma, who had been sewing non-stop for a full week. Anything I can do to help? Vicki asked. I watered the garden, and supper and dessert are both in the oven. You've been busy. Did your sister help with the garden? Vicki shrugged. The same way she always helps. She's young, Ma told her. She'll get better about doing her share of the work as she gets older. Ma had been saying the same thing about Barbara for years. Vicki didn't agree with her, but she nodded anyway. I hope so. Trust me. Without you here to bear the heaviest load, she'll realize how much you've done, and she'll have to step up and do more. It's that simple. You did the same when Emma moved out. Vicki frowned. I was never lazy like Barbara. You were very similar to your younger sister until Emma married. Then you quickly took on more chores and more nights to cook. You're ready to be a wife now. Give your sister a few years to get to where you are. Yes, Ma. Ma held up Barbara's dress. What do you think? Her sister's dress was red, and it was a real lady's dress. Vicki realized it would be her sister's first dress to actually be fitted to her. She's going to love it, Vicki said, smiling. Ma smiled. I sure hope you're right. Anything I can do to help you? She asked. With supper in the oven, I have to be indoors, but I've completed all my chores. That's good, Ma said. I don't guess there's a lot for you to do. Maybe you should take a little time to write in your journal. You know I still keep it? Vicki asked, surprised. Your sister has told me often enough. Don't worry though. She can't find wherever you're hiding it now, and she's sure trying. Vicki smiled. I'll be happy when I don't have to hide it in this house anymore, she said. I'll either keep writing in it after I'm married, or I won't. But either way, I won't have a sister trying to find it. Ma laughed. Barbara looks up to you. She wants to know all the little details about your life that you don't tell her. She's very curious about your relationship with John. We all are really. He seems to have come out of nowhere and appeared knowing he wanted to marry you. We really did meet in the fall. That last wagon train that came through was the one he was part of. Do you remember the one Abby Appleby came in on? John was on the same one. Why didn't you tell us about him? Ma asked. Vicki shrugged. It just all seemed too special to talk about. I wasn't trying to be mysterious. I understand, Ma said. I was the same way when your father was courting me. My pa thought I was too young to marry, and he told me daily how terrible of a cook I was. I couldn't wait to get out of his house. I didn't know that. Vicki said. Well, it's not something I talk about a lot. I just hope you're going to be as happy with John as you think you will. I will, Vicki said, knowing it was true. John was the perfect man for her. She was certain of it. After the pies were out of the oven, she got ready for the dance, wishing she could wear the new dress her mother just made her, but she knew she needed to save it for the wedding. She put on her church dress, fixed her hair, and pinched her cheeks to give them color, though she knew her ma would be very upset if she knew she was pinching her cheeks that way. When she heard a wagon in the yard, she took the apple pie and carried it out to the wagon, knowing her mother would take the other pie as their family's offering. Vicki felt the apple pie was her first contribution to a potluck as half of a couple. John jumped down from the wagon when he saw her and kissed her. He helped her into the wagon and got in beside her. What are you taking to the potluck? He asked, nodding at the pie in her hands. I made a chicken pot pie for Ma to take, and I made an apple pie for us to take. He smiled. Very nice. I feel like I'm contributing now. That's how I feel too. This is the first thing I've taken to a potluck as part of a couple, so I made two distinct things. Good. He started down the hill, toward the church. I met up with Elmer King Thursday, and he came right over. All the cabinets are in the kitchen now. All I need to do is get a stove, and I can do that on Monday morning. How about marrying me Monday afternoon? She almost squealed with excitement. I love that idea. I'll tell Ma. I think she's almost done with all the sewing. How much sewing can there be? He asked. She shrugged. It's Ma's wedding gift to us. I made a simple table, and Elmer is going to make a nicer one and chairs, but we can eat off the one I made until he gets them done. I'm so excited that our wedding is finally happening. Me too. It's so hard to stop when we kiss. I'm glad you feel the same way about that as I do. I'm definitely ready to make love with you. Good, she said. We'll do that on Monday evening. Ma is planning a wedding supper after the wedding. I'd be happy for the two of us to go in front of Pastor Jed and speak our vows, but Ma says she wants a real wedding this time. We were just settling in when both Roy and Emma got married, and she feels like she missed out on a lot by not being able to go to their weddings, so ours will be larger, no matter what we want. He frowned. You don't want a big wedding? She shook her head. And since we're giving her the wedding date 2 days before the wedding, there's no way we'll have a big one. I like the way you think. When they got to the church, he took the pie from her and carried it inside. Emma hurried over to her as soon as she saw her with John. Introduce me to your beau. Vicki smiled at John. This is my older sister, Emma. Emma, this is my fiancé John. I need to walk down the hill more than I do. Emma said, snuggling her baby close. How long have you been seeing each other? Vicki laughed softly. We met when his wagon train came through. It was the same one Abby was part of. We both kept thinking of each other. He moved back here, and we started courting. That's fast. When is the wedding? Vicki grinned. We talked about that on the way here. I think we're going to marry on Monday. Are we invited? Oh, of course. I'm hoping there won't be too many people there, but you and all the Applebys and our family of course need to be there. Well, I'm excited you'll still be close. At least I hope you will. Emma looked at John. Where's your land? Right on the lake, he said. I've got the house built, and I'll have a stove Monday morning, so we're marrying Monday evening. In a hurry, are you? Emma asked. I remember your hurry when you married Jared, so you get to say nothing, Vicki said. She wanted to stick her tongue out at her sister, but she knew better. Maybe in private, but never in public. Vicki carried the pie to the table, making certain to put it with the other desserts before going back to stand with John. Emma was still talking to John. Do you know what time on Monday? She asked. John shook his head. We haven't had a chance to talk to the pastor yet. He's right over there. I'll introduce you. Emma led John to Pastor Jed and introduced them, Vicki lagging behind. Emma had always been more outgoing than she was. What's a good time to get you to marry us sometime Monday afternoon or evening? John asked. The pastor frowned. Emma's married. Vicki laughed. John and I are marrying. The pastor looked relieved. I thought you'd been listening to the Mormon teachings. Not at all, John said. I only want one wife. How would a man keep up with two of them? Don't ask me, Pastor Jed said. It's all I can do to keep up with Hannah and the children. Is there a time that's better than others? Vicki asked. My ma is planning on a supper that you and Mrs. Scott are welcome to join us for. Let's do it about 5 then. I'm always happy to give Hannah a night off from cooking. She has her hands full with the children and housework. I honestly don't know how she does it all. 5 sounds good. Thank you, Pastor, Vicki said, slowly moving away. Now we just need to tell Ma it's Monday. Ma doesn't know the date yet? Have you lost your mind, Victoria Abigail? Nope. Just my heart. Vicki pulled John away from her sister. Emma is the oldest sister, as I'm sure you can tell. I never felt that I could live up to her. I think most younger sisters feel that way, John said. Don't worry about it. Shortly after, Vicki saw her mother walk into the church, and she rushed over to her. Ma, the house is done. We're getting married at 5 in the evening on Monday. That will give John time to have my new stove delivered. Ma nodded. How many people do you plan to invite? I'm thinking the Applebys, the pastor and Mrs. Scott, and maybe Abby's best friend and her husband. They'll be our closest neighbors. Roy and Henri, of course. Sounds good. I can have everything I'm doing ready by then, and if I talk to Henri and Emma, we'll have all the food we need. Vicki grinned at John. She'd been worried her mother would have a reason that it was too soon for them to marry, and she was glad there was nothing standing in their way. John nodded. Thank you for helping with the fast service, Mrs. Williams. Oh, just call me Ma. Everyone else does, Ma said. John smiled. I'll do that happily, Ma. Word spread quickly among the family, and when Vicki saw Anna walk into the church, she hurried over. John says we're going to be neighbors, and I just wanted to invite you to the small wedding we're having here at 5 on Monday evening. Oh, we'd love to come. Anna said. Abby will be here, right? Vicki nodded. She certainly will. Sounds wonderful, Anna said. Soon it was time for their meal, and they had a group prayer, and all the women moved to stand behind what they'd made for the meal. Ma sent Barbara to stand behind the chicken pot pie because they all knew if she stood behind it, no one would dare to eat it. Once the meal had been served and eaten, the women made quick work of the dishes, and then the dancing started. Vicki's heart skipped a beat as the band warmed up, and she smiled over at John, who was talking with Mr. Appleby. Hopefully, he was arranging for his hogs. As her part of the cleanup was over, she joined John, who was indeed talking about hogs. "Mr. Appleby," she said softly. "Vicki," he said with a smile. "Your young man was just telling me about the wedding on Monday. I hope you two will be happy together, and that your new hogs will be just as happy." Vicki laughed. "I'm not sure that their happiness affects their taste very much." "No, not really, but I still think we should be as kind to them as we can be." Chapter 7. As soon as the dancing started, John took Vicki's hand and led her out onto the dance floor. One room of the church had been built large enough for dances and potlucks and anything else they wanted, and if there was overflow, they'd move the pews to the edges of the room. He held her close as they danced to a slow song, and then they danced to one much faster, and while her nimble feet could easily keep up with the music, he stomped on her foot more than once. Finally, she took his hand and led him away from the other dancers. "I need to be able to walk down the aisle at my wedding, so I think we're only dancing to slow songs for the rest of the night." John looked chagrined. "I'm so sorry. I would never intentionally hurt you. I'm well aware. I wouldn't be marrying you otherwise." She led him over to a bucket of water, with tin cups to drink from. "I enjoy the fast songs, but we'll have to practice a little more before we can get them perfect." He nodded. "That's probably for the best. It never occurred to me that there would be faster songs. In my mind, a dance is holding one another and swaying to the music. I think I'd like that kind of dance a great deal more with you." Henri walked over a moment later, a baby in her arms, and a toddler trailing along behind her. "This must be John," she said. "I'm Henri Williams. I'm married to Vicki's older brother, Roy." "It's so nice to meet you," he said. "I heard you're responsible for the receipt for the chicken and dumplings that made me so happy the other night." Henri nodded. "That would be me. It's so easy to teach Vicki new things. She's a very good student." "Well, I appreciate the time you've spent teaching her to cook after hearing about the way her mother cooks." Henri nodded. "Her mother is better now, but she's still not what I would consider a good cook." "Henri is the best sister-in-law a girl could ask for," Vicki said with a smile. "The only thing I want from you for a wedding gift is receipts. I started making you a book full of them when I saw you talking to John back in October. And I'm always willing to help if something is harder than you think it will be. And I'll always add the little extra to the dress you're making." "We make a good team," Henri said. "We do," Vicki agreed. "What do you mean by little extra on dresses?" John asked. "Embroidery or a lace collar. Ma loves to sew so much, and she's really good, so she taught all of us girls to sew, and we're good at making things extra special." "Could you make a special lace collar for my ma?" he asked. She nodded. "I'd be happy to." "I'm assuming she would have the skills to sew it onto a dress?" "Definitely. But she'd probably give the collar to one of my sisters." "I can make 4 easily," she said. "And then each of your sisters can have one, but so can your ma. I'll just do each one a little differently, and then they won't look all the same." "That sounds like a good idea," he said. "If you don't mind, that would make me very happy. My sisters all feel they'll never marry because they don't have pretty clothes. They could dress up anything with a pretty lace collar." Henri pointed to the lace collar on the baby's dress. "Like little Millie." "Yes, that's the type of thing I want." "I can do that with no problem," Vicki said. "I'd be happy to." "Thank you," he said. "Ma would never accept money or anything like that as a gift, but lace collars, she would definitely accept for her and the girls." Vicki smiled. "There's a slow song again. Would you care to dance with me?" She nodded. "See you later, Henri." Henri watched them go to the dance floor with a longing look on her face, then went to find her mother-in-law to get her to watch her grandchildren while she danced with her husband. After church the following day, John took Vicki back to the house so she could see his progress. There were beautiful cabinets in the kitchen, not many because the kitchen was rather small, but it was enough for Vicki's needs. A bed had been moved in and set up against one wall of the room. "I love it, John. It's just perfect." He laughed. "Oh, it's definitely not perfect, but I'm happy if you're happy." "I am so happy with it. I'll make curtains and a tablecloth, and it will be the most beautiful little home in all of Oregon Territory." She threw her arms around him and kissed him quickly. "And I want the garden to be right outside the kitchen window, so I can look at it while I'm doing the dishes. I'll make sure that gets plowed early in the week, so you can get everything in the ground." "There's time," she said. "We had an early spring this year, but we don't usually plant until May." "I see." He glanced over at the bed and realized it may be just a bit too much temptation to have her inside alone with him. "We'd better go," he said. "Why?" "We just got here." "Because temptation is strong. I want to take you to that bed and have my way with you, but I can't do that until tomorrow evening and we've spoken our vows." She sighed. "I know. I want to do just what you want to do. Let's go outside then, and we'll talk about the garden." "All right." "And I want a porch swing," she said. "I know it's a lot to ask, especially since we don't have a porch yet, but a swing to sit on when I need a few minutes in the middle of the day would make me so happy." He nodded. "I can do that," he said. "You don't want me to wait to build a porch?" "I don't think there's any way you'll get around to putting up a porch until next summer at the earliest. Just make me a swing, and I'll be happy." "All right. I can do that." John was determined to do whatever it took to make her happy. "Do you have a pen and paper?" she asked. He nodded. "Sure do. I want to make a list of what we'll need for the pantry, so I can cook." "Is that all right?" "Of course. You're going to be feeding me, right?" "Yes, I will. 3 meals a day every day." She looked around the little house. "Are you already living here?" "Tonight will be my first night to spend here, and the only night I plan on being alone here." "You're going to be here tomorrow night." She glanced at the bed again. Did one day really matter that much? She knew it mattered to her ma, and she didn't let herself go down that road. No, she was going to be legally married before she made love with him. That was her vow to herself. John fetched her the paper and a pencil, and she sat down on the little bench and carefully wrote out a list of what she would need. "It's going to be a lot this first trip," she said. "I have pots and pans and dishes, but I don't have any flour or sugar. I have things to cook on, but nothing to cook." He laughed. "Just give me the list, and I'll pop by the store first thing in the morning to get it delivered with the stove." "Are you sure they have a stove?" she asked. Vicki had rarely stepped foot into the store. Her ma had gotten into the habit of going alone over the years, and it was something she'd stayed with when they'd settled there. He nodded. "They had one in the store last week, and I paid for it then. Mr. Jensen is just waiting for me to tell him when I'm ready to have it delivered." "Wonderful. Then I really will be cooking on it by Tuesday morning." "Yes, you will. Would you mind if I also had a fire pit outside? Sometimes it's easier to cook meat over an open fire." "I don't mind at all. It's your house, and the yard is yours to decide what to do with." She grinned. "Flowers. Would you mind if I planted flowers in front of the house?" He shrugged. "Not if they're not too costly," he said. "I'm doing my best not to waste money on frivolous purchases." "I would never waste money. I could take in sewing if it would help us out financially." "No, I don't want you working. Just try to be frugal, and I'll be a happy man. I have some extra from mine work, and some of the men on the trail paid me to take their turns watching guard. I was happy to take anything I could get. Let me know if you change your mind, she said. I will. And I so appreciate your willingness to work. Maybe you could be in charge of the hogs, and we could sell them if we had enough. I'm happy to do that, she said. Whatever it takes. You'll be my family starting tomorrow, and I want to do everything I can to help us. He smiled. Tonight will be my last night sleeping alone, he said softly. I always had to share a room with my 5 brothers, and I thought sleeping alone would be the most wonderful thing in the world. Now all I can think about is sleeping with someone beside me. In my arms. All I can think about is you slipping inside me. I know I shouldn't be thinking impure thoughts that way, but I cannot wait. He shuddered. You're killing me, Vicki. I can wait one more day, can't I? If I can, you can, she said with a smile. Drive me home and have supper with my family. Then the next time you see me, I'll be the girl walking down the aisle toward you. She handed him the list she'd finished. I'll take this with me in the morning. I really do need to take you home, though, or there's no way I'm going to be able to wait another 24 minutes, let alone 24 hours. I love the house. I'm glad you brought me here, but let's get back to my parents' house before we do something stupid. He didn't have to be told twice. One last kiss before we go, he said. I'm not sure that's a smart thing to do. I just have to have one more taste of you. She went willingly into his arms, wrapping herself around him. His kiss made her feel so much, especially in the core of her body. By the time he let her go, she was tingling all over. We have to go now, she said. She knew she wouldn't be able to say no to him again, and she'd made a vow to herself and her mother that nothing would happen before their wedding. In the wagon on the way back, she sat a proper distance away from him. They never should have started kissing the way they had, but oh, how she was happy they were marrying. One more day. They could both last one more day. She didn't draw an easy breath until they were in her parents' yard. She knew she would do nothing untoward there. Her parents would never allow it. She realized as he helped her down that they hadn't really spoken the entire drive back. The air had been too charged with emotion, and more than that, with passion. When they walked into the house, Barbara was just putting supper on the table. We weren't sure you were coming back, she said. I made a cottage pie for supper. Oh, that sounds delicious, Vicki said, going into the kitchen to wash her hands in the bucket kept there for that purpose. What's a cottage pie? John asked as he washed his hands as well. It's beef that we've put through a mincer, mashed potatoes, peas, carrots, and some sauce. It's absolutely delicious. I can't wait to try it, he said. Do you make cottage pie? I sure do. I absolutely love it. I hope you'll serve it often then. He loved how this family had meat with almost every meal, and he hoped they'd be able to carry that on, but as a farmer, he felt he would always have meat on hand. He hoped so anyway. When they all sat down to supper, Ma smiled at John. Tomorrow at this time, you'll be our son. Welcome to the family. John smiled. Thank you. I can't tell you how proud I am that Vicki has agreed to be my wife. After the prayer, he tried the cottage pie, and he smiled and nodded. I may like this more than chicken and dumplings, he said. They can be equal in your mind, Vicki countered. Barbara smiled. I'm going to be the only daughter still at home. It's going to be wonderful. Vicki raised an eyebrow at her sister. Double chores? I do worry about you sometimes, Barbara. I didn't think of it that way. Now you can, Vicki said, realizing she was being petty. But there will be one less person, so the chores will be lighter as well. Barbara smiled again. They will. And I know if I beg enough you'll come over and help with the gardening. I'll have my own garden to tend to, Vicki said. I'm so excited to put it in. We just finished putting in a garden, Barbara said. I'm sure you've lost your mind. John shook his head. It feels like I'm at home and my sisters are arguing about the chores. Ma laughed. These two have always bickered. In a few years, I do think they'll be the best of friends, though. Maybe. John didn't care if they were friends or not, as long as Vicki was happy. And he had a feeling that he could easily see to her happiness. When he left that night, he kissed Vicki lightly. Save all your kisses for me, he said softly. I always have, Vicki said. As she watched him drive away, she realized it was for the last time, because this time tomorrow, she would be his wife, and sleeping in his bed with him. She shivered a bit, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. She was so looking forward to being his wife. Chapter 8. The morning of her wedding, Vicki was up before dawn. She didn't need to be up that early, but her nervous energy was keeping her from sleeping. So she went into the kitchen and mixed up bread dough, thinking they could all have a cinnamon roll with breakfast. She preferred the pastry still warm, but it meant getting up much earlier than usual, which she had, so she took the time to make their breakfast special. It was the last one she'd cook for her family. Why that made her feel a bit sad on what should be the happiest day of her life, she wasn't sure. She worked on the meal while humming a tune. When Ma got up, she stared at Vicki for a moment. What are you making? She asked. Usually, Ma took care of breakfast. They did a lot of oatmeal. Vicki shrugged. I was too excited to sleep, so I thought I'd make a special breakfast. Ma, still in her nightgown, sat down at the table. I see. I guess it's the last meal you'll make for the family. I'll make lunch too, Vicki said quickly. I want to make the most of my last day with you here. Ma laughed softly. You make it sound like you're moving across the country. You're going to be a very short drive away. I know, but visits won't be the same. Are you getting cold feet? Vicki sighed, sitting down with her mother as she waited for the cinnamon rolls to rise. Not really. I'm just very aware that this is my last day living at home. This evening, I'll be going to John's house with him, and when I return, I'll no longer be at my home, I'll be a visitor. Ma reached out and squeezed her hand. Do you have any questions for me about the wedding night? Vicki chuckled. Most mothers would be telling their daughter what their duty was to their husband. Not my Ma. Do you need advice to make your wedding night better? Ma smiled. No one should go into marriage afraid of her wedding night like I did. What you will do with John will be as enjoyable as you let it be. Some women close their eyes and refuse to acknowledge the fact their husband is trying to make them feel good. I don't want any of my daughters to do that. I appreciate that, Ma. I really do. I think John does too. He knows I'm eager for our wedding night, and not afraid. Oh, Ma. It was all I could do to keep my vow to you yesterday. He was showing me our house, and we were alone with a bed right there. Using that bed was all I could think about. We drove slowly back to town because we had to leave to keep from anticipating our wedding vows. Ma smiled and nodded. I'm just glad you were able to. Tonight will be much more special because of it. Vicki nodded. I think so too. Don't expect it to be perfect the first few times. A man needs to learn control, and his first time with his wife, he will have no control at all. Be patient with him, and just love him. I'll do my very best, Vicki said. I do think we're going to enjoy being together. Of course, you will. If you enjoy kissing him, then you'll enjoy making love with him. It's as simple as that. Vicki nodded. I really enjoy kissing him, so I know my marriage will be a good one. There's more to marriage than just making love, Ma said softly. There's work involved, and it's work you know how to do, but you need to keep it up every day. Just as he'll go to work on the farm, you'll be working to keep the house clean, to cook 3 meals per day, to plant, weed, water, and harvest a garden, and then spend your time putting up the harvest. You have a vital role in your marriage, and you must make the best of it. Vicki nodded. I'll also be in charge of the chickens and pigs, she said, smiling at the thought of the piglets she'd be raising. She would cull only a few each year so they could sell some for meat, but continue to grow. Ma smiled. I think that will be your favorite part of your chores. I know you love gardening, but when you get to see those animals grow and take a liking to you, you're going to know that you are doing what you were born to do. I hope so, Ma. I really do. You'll love it. I promise. I had your pa make a few boxes to carry your chickens home in. I'm sending a rooster and 5 good-laying hens for eggs. I think you'll be quite happy. You know what to feed them and how to feed them. Pigs are like chickens, and they'll eat everything in front of them. They'll need a pen, but I think you'll prefer to leave the chickens as free range. They'll need a henhouse for the winter, but in the summer, they'll eat insects, and you won't have to feed them quite as much. Pigs you'll always have to feed. Vicki nodded, getting up to put the cinnamon rolls into the oven. How about eggs, bacon, and cinnamon rolls for breakfast? That sounds wonderful. Thank you for getting up early to cook. It'll make my morning a great deal easier, which is good, because my daughter is getting married today. Oh, Ma, I can't wait. I wish it was time now. By early afternoon, Vicki was exhausted. All of her things were in the hope chest her father had bought from Elmer King, and it was packed nicely. After the wedding, they would get her hope chest and the chickens out of her parents' wagon and drive straight to the lake and their home. Everything was ready for the wedding except her. She needed to dress and fix her hair, but she needed to sleep more. She couldn't remember the last time she'd napped, but she knew if she didn't that day, she wouldn't be as attentive and willing for her wedding night. She found her Ma outside watering the garden. Ma looked up. Everything ready? Everything except me, Vicki said. Would it be all right if I took a nap? I slept so little last night. I know. Go ahead. I'll make sure you're awake in time to dress for the wedding. I want to try something new with my hair as well, Vicki said. No you don't, Ma replied. Something new may not look right, and then you'd have to start all over. Pin most of your hair up in a bun, but let a little of it fall free. Yes, Ma. I'll do that after I nap. Vicki hid a yawn behind her hand. I think I should be awake by 4 or so. Ma nodded. I'll wake you. Vicki went back into the house and sat on her bed, looking around her room. This would be her last time to sleep in this bed. Oh, it was all becoming so real. She'd been dreaming about this day since she met John, and now that it was here, she was ready to do all she could. She laid on her side and closed her eyes, and sleep claimed her quickly. Ma woke her at 4:30. I let you sleep another half hour, because I knew you needed it. Change into your dress, and I'll help fix your hair. Vicki nodded. She could smell chicken and dumplings, and realized Barbara must have been cooking them for the wedding supper. She changed and went out into the dining room, where Ma was sitting, doing a bit of embroidery while she waited. Does this look all right? She asked. Ma looked her up and down and smiled. It fits you perfectly. You look beautiful today. Your eyes look tired, though. You may want to rest a cool damp rag on them. I can do that while you do my hair, Vicki said, hurrying to the kitchen for the damp rag. While she sat, her mother worked on her hair. You have an exact look in mind, don't you, Ma? I do. I can just see how it will look, so you sit there patiently and let me have my way. I haven't fixed your hair since you were a little girl. I can't remember the last time anyone fixed my hair, she said. I have all the chicken and dumplings done, Barbara said. I know I fixed enough to feed us, Roy and Henry's family, and Emma, and Jared's family. I know others are making them too, so I am going to say I've made enough. Thanks for helping out with my wedding supper, Vicki said. If it gets you out of the house faster. Barbara Ann. Ma said. You do not talk to your sister that way. Knowing her ma was behind her and wouldn't see, Vicki poked her tongue out at her sister, getting a laugh from Barbara and, I get to move into your room tonight, Barbara said. It's bigger than mine. I hope you love it as much as I have, Vicki said. My whole house isn't as big as the cabin we lived in when we first moved here. It's good when there's room to grow, Ma said. Once her hair was finished, Vicki looked into a mirror and smiled. That's perfect, Ma. Thank you. She took the cloth from her eyes. Now I need to go pinch my cheeks, she teased. On your wedding day, I think that's fine, Ma said to Vicki's surprise. Vicki smiled. You're the best ma ever. Vicki and Barbara each took one end of her hope chest and carried it outside. I'm so glad Pa finally got us both hope chests again, Barbara said. Every time I put something into my hope bag, I was embarrassed for myself and all of humanity. Have you ever thought of writing a book? Vicki asked. Barbara shook her head. No, should I? Well, you've certainly mastered the use of hyperbole, and I think that would be quite useful in writing a book. You're right. I'll start one tonight. They put the heavy chest down in the yard where Pa would pull the wagon to, so he could load it. I'm going to miss you, even though you make me crazy. Vicki smiled. I'll miss you too. All day, all I've been able to think about was my last times. I cooked breakfast for the last time for my family. I woke up in the morning in this house for the last time. I slept in my bed for the last time. I should be looking to the new times, but I know I'm going to miss working with you and Ma every day. Barbara nodded, and to Vicki's surprise, her sister hugged her tightly. I hope you're happy with John. He seems like a good man. He is, Vicki said, feeling confident in her statement. Living on his farm is going to make me very happy. But if you want to come and help me plant later this week. No way. Barbara said, laughing. You know how much I hate gardening. Almost as much as I love it, Vicki said, grinning at her sister. Isn't it nice that God makes everyone different from everyone else? It is. I hope you'll let me come visit you. You're my sister. You can visit every third Tuesday as long as there's a full moon. Barbara laughed. I'll keep that in mind. When Pa got home a few minutes later, he hurried inside. I need to get cleaned up, and then we'll go. When he and Ma stepped outside a few minutes later, Vicki was proud of how they looked. Each had taken care with their appearance, and they looked ready to go. Father of the bride, Pa said. Again. Only one more time for my Barbara. A long time. Barbara said. I'm going to be the happiest only child alive for as long as I can make it work. Ma laughed. You'll meet a young man soon enough. There's no doubt in my mind. I don't think I will, Barbara said. I'm happy to be on my own. Maybe I'll be a spinster and make hats. That's what Edna told me she was going to do. I think she'll be good at it too. Why would she want to be a spinster who made hats? Ma asked. Vicki shook her head. Edna Blue was a mystery. I don't think I'll ever understand half of what she said and did. Pa nodded. Her father was a bit odd, but nothing like that daughter of his. Just the way she danced on Saturday nights told me all I needed to know. She was a half-wit. I don't think so, Barbara said. She was intelligent, but she simply said strange things all the time that confused everyone around her. Maybe, Vicki said. Instead of climbing into the back of the wagon, her pa helped Ma up and then Vicki. It was cramped on the wagon seat, but Vicki didn't let that bother her. She definitely didn't want to be seen climbing out of the back of the wagon at the church on her wedding day. Sitting in the back had always made her feel as if she was a small child. Now that she was going to be married, she was a grown woman, and she felt others should treat her as such. She waited for her pa to help her down at the church, and she went into the parsonage, which was part of the church. That way she could do her walk down the aisle, and John wouldn't see her before the wedding. She thought it was a silly superstition, but Ma kept telling her it didn't hurt to be careful. She also wore something new, her dress. Something blue, a bouquet of wildflowers, something borrowed, her mother's favorite hair comb. On her feet were her old shoes, because they hadn't had time to order new ones. That covered that silly superstition as well. Vicki cared about none of it. She only cared that she was about to walk down the aisle to the man of her dreams, with all her family watching over them. For a moment, she wished Edna could be there to take part in her wedding. She was the best wedding guest, always giving sex advice to the newlyweds. What more could she ask for? She took a deep breath and started down the aisle on her father's arm. When she walked back down, she would be John's wife. What a glorious day. Chapter 9. John turned to her as Vicki walked toward him, her gaze on his face and nothing else. Pastor Jed had a big smile on his face, as he loved performing weddings. He had once said that he preferred funerals because you always knew then how the person's life had turned out, but he was happy to do weddings as well. When she reached John, and Pastor Jed had asked her father who gave her in marriage, her father placed her hand into John's and they turned to face Pastor Jed together. Vicki had never enjoyed being the center of attention, but John's hand held her steady. He made her feel as if she was the most important thing in his entire world, and truthfully, she was. When she made her vows, Vicki immediately realized she'd kept the vow she'd made to both her mother and herself. She had not sinned with John. Then the pastor was proclaiming them man and wife, and John didn't have to be told to kiss his bride. His lips were on hers before the pastor got the words out, and everyone laughed. Afterward, they went into the other room of the church for their wedding supper, and John was thrilled to see the chicken and dumplings. "Thank you," he said looking at Vicki, knowing she was the one who had decided to serve them. "Anything to make you happy," she said softly. There was no band that evening, so there would be no dancing. Instead, their supper was served in silence, with only the voices of people talking over their meals, providing the background music. The food tasted like sawdust to Vicki, and she wanted to just leave the church with John and go to the little house he built for them and be alone, knowing they were allowed to do what they both wanted so badly. Her family surrounded them, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were on John and only John. Emma poked her in the side. "There are people here other than your husband," she said. "But he's the only one I married today, so shush." Vicki turned her attention back to John, who laughed softly. "I guess I get all the attention today," he said. "You can have attention on another day." Jared, Emma's husband, nodded emphatically. "That's how it should be." As soon as they felt they could get away without anyone thinking they were escaping too quickly, they headed out to John's wagon. Her father and Roy followed them outside, so they could move the chickens into John's wagon as well as her hope chest. John offered to help, but Pa and Roy were used to working together and made short work of the job. When they were finished, she hugged her father and brother. "Thank you." Pa nodded. "Be happy." "I will." There was no doubt in her mind that John would make her the happiest woman alive. Once they finally reached the house that was. "I'm going to drive as fast as I feel comfortable driving," he whispered as they moved off the church lawn and started toward the lake. "Brilliant idea," she said. "I think so," he said, smiling at her. "I'm surprised your parents were so willing to let us get married so quickly. I expected it would take months once I settled here, to convince your father." "Nah." Barbara was practically singing and dancing and celebrating being the only child left at home. He laughed. I could tell she was excited about it. "Any last-minute advice from you, Ma?" he asked. Actually, yes. She thinks I'm putting a bit too much emphasis on the physical side of our marriage, and reminded me that I have plenty of duties outside the bedroom. She made this long list of things I'll be required to do, but none of them are things I haven't already done at home. Well, except for the hogs. When do we get those? They need a few more weeks, he said. Probably end of June. That works for me. Vicki scooted closer to him on the wagon seat. I cannot tell you how much I have been anticipating tonight. You and me both. She realized then her mother hadn't shown her the nightgown for her wedding night, but she had a feeling it was packed in the back of the wagon somewhere. She'd expected to take her hope chest and the chickens. Instead, there were many extra boxes in the back of John's wagon, and she had no idea what she would find in them. It would be like a treasure hunt, and she knew she'd enjoy it. Did you get the stove? She asked. He nodded. And all the other things you asked for. Mrs. Jensen said it looked like I was setting up house, and I told her we were marrying today. She said to tell you best wishes, and if you need anything from her, to let her know. She's so sweet, Vicki said. I'm glad I can call her friend. When they finally reached the house, she looked in the back of the wagon. Let me help you get all this unloaded before we do anything else. The chickens have already been cooped up too long, even though we don't have a coop. We will have one just as soon as I finish the barn. Thankfully, there's not a ton to do with such a small herd, but it will grow. She took the chickens out one at a time and carried them to the area where John planned to build their barn. She knew each of the chickens, and though her mother had never been one to name a bird that would someday end up on their table, she could tell them apart easily. They were hers. Then she helped with the boxes her mother had added, and she was surprised at how many had been sneaked in without her looking. Someone must have gone home to get more, but she hadn't noticed anyone missing from the supper. Of course, she'd only had eyes for John. Once he had her trunk inside, he shook his head. This is a lot more than I thought you were bringing with you. I thought I was bringing my hope chest and 6 chickens. That's all. Instead, I have all these extra boxes with who knows what in them. I'm going to have to dig through them for something before we can go to bed, though. She desperately wanted to wear the nightgown she was certain her mother had made her. It can't wait, he asked. She shook her head. It can't. I have to look, and unfortunately, I have to look alone. Could you give me 20 minutes to get ready for bed, please? He groaned. I guess I can wait 20 minutes, but after that, I'm not letting anything get in my way. She smiled. You know I'm as anxious as you. He kissed her quickly and left the house, and she worked to open all the boxes her mother had packed. There were some things that thrilled her. A quilt her mother had made for her years before, that had always been intended to cover her marriage bed, and she quickly spread it out on the bed that had one thin blanket on it. It brightened up the whole house. In another box, she found not only jerky, but salt pork and some of the meat she'd helped can the fall before. In another, she found a note from her pa that was folded, closed with John's name on it. She wanted to look, but she knew it was rude to read someone else's mail. Finally, in the last box, she found the nightgown. She quickly pulled her dress over her head and divested herself of her underwear, pulling on the nightgown. Then she looked down at herself, and she could easily see her nipples and the shape of her breasts through the lace of the bodice. She had a feeling John may never let her wear anything else once he saw her in that. While she waited, she put the note for John on the table, and she put the food into the kitchen. She'd probably carry it down to the cellar later, but for now, it was good enough. As she removed things, she immediately put them where they belonged, and all at once, the bare house seemed to transform into a home. She was very pleased with all she'd accomplished when John opened the door. I hope you're ready because I'm not sure how much longer I can wait, he called as he opened the door. She turned from what she'd been doing and stood before him in the nightgown her mother had made. His jaw dropped at the sight of her. Where did that come from? My mom made it special for our wedding night. She knew she should feel embarrassed at how see-through the thing was, but it made her feel good to see the desire so clearly on his face. She spun in a small circle. Do you like it? I'm not sure like is the right word, he said gruffly. He walked across the small room and took her in his arms. Your mother is something special. Vicki grinned. It's nice, isn't it? He nodded, staring at her for a moment, before lowering his head to kiss her. She wore the thing for less than 10 minutes, but it had done its job beautifully. He pulled it over her head, and she unbuttoned his shirt, needing him to be as naked as she was. As she struggled to get him out of his clothes, his hands moved all over her. One moment cupping her breasts, and then next pulling her into him by her bottom. She shook her head. If you could hold still for just a moment, we could get these clothes off you, and it would be much faster. Abruptly he dropped his hands to the waist of his pants, unbuttoning them. I'm all for fast. Within moments, they were on the bed, and their hands were all over each other. When she reached down to touch him where she'd never touched a man before, he groaned. I like that a little too much. Why too much? Because if you don't stop, there will only be fun for me and none for you. She giggled. We can't have that now, can we? No, we cannot. When he covered her body with his, he reached a hand down to guide himself inside her. She made a sound, but even she wasn't sure if it was pain or pleasure, as the two had seemed to merge together in that moment. When he was deeply inside her, he held still for a moment. I think you said something about not being able to wait until I could slip inside you. She moaned softly. And I was right. That feeling is like nothing else. When they had finished, she moved toward him and rested her head on his shoulder. That was nice. We should do it again sometime. He laughed. Maybe in an hour or two. That would be nice. He sighed happily. I'm so glad you agreed to marry me, and not just because it feels so incredible to be inside you. Is that so? She asked, leaning on one elbow as she watched him. Yup. There was a note addressed to you in one of the boxes I unpacked, she said. I didn't read it because my name was not added. Where did you put it? He asked. On the table. There's no way I can get up and go read it. I may never be able to move again. He kissed her softly. Marriage is amazing. She laughed. The first few hours are absolutely perfect. She climbed out of bed and walked across the room to fetch the letter, wondering what it was all about. She handed it to him, and only then did she realize they'd forgotten to blow out the candle. One of them would have to be responsible and not waste candles. He sat up in bed. You didn't have to get it, he said. I was curious about it. Someone in my family must have written you a note and I was not included. I need to know what it said. He read the note and smiled. Your pa and Mr. Appleby are giving us 6 heifers each. And they are all expecting, which means 24 new cows for our little dairy farm. Vicki smiled happily. Oh, that's wonderful, John. Did he say when? Your father and Roy plan to drive them here at the end of the week. That's going to take a while. He shook his head. I think we'll have overnight visitors one night. She sighed. We'll have to enjoy each other a great deal before they get here so we won't be so lonely for each other, she said. I'm all for it, John told her. I noticed you plowed the space for my garden already. Have I told you how much that means to me? He shook his head. No, you haven't. Shame on you. Well, it means that I can get out there tomorrow and start digging in the dirt. I find nothing in this world more soothing than being outdoors. And cooking for your husband, right? Well, of course, she said. Ma sent a bunch of jerky, and some other meats that I helped put up last fall, so we'll be set on meat for a while. I wasn't expecting that, but there it was in one of the boxes. That's good, he said. Will save us time and money, and there's not a lot of either our first summer on the farm. Are you sure you don't want me to take in some sewing to help out with the finances? She asked. He shook his head. If it needs to happen later on, I'll let you know, but for now, I'd like to be able to support my wife. Make sure you do let me know if something comes up, she said. I'll spend tomorrow morning setting up the house, and then tomorrow afternoon I'll start planting the garden. I'm so excited to have my own garden, and Ma sent a bunch of seeds as well. My parents didn't do any of this for Emma and Roy, but they had just finished on the trail back then. They didn't have the extra to give them. Guess we got married at the right time, he said. We did. I don't want Pa and Roy staying in the house, but I don't think we have a better option for them. I don't think so either. It's fine. All right. Will you be eating lunch with me? There may be times when I have to take my lunch with me when I leave in the morning, but for the most part, I'll be eating with you. Oh, good. She snuggled back down beside him, happy as a clam. Marriage was everything she'd dreamed it would be. Chapter 10. When the cows were delivered Friday, Vicki had made a large meal to share with her father and brother. They brought the cows in, and then Pa said, "We're going to head straight back. Neither of us wants to be burdens on your newlywed games." Vicki laughed. I cooked supper. I have a beef stew ready to eat right now, with fresh bread. Can't you stay for at least that long? Pa and Roy exchanged a look. That jerky we had for lunch sure didn't last. Sit, Vicki said. It'll only take me a minute to get it on the table. Hearing the sounds of the extra cows, John came in from his work on the barn. Thank you so much, he said. I can't think of a better wedding gift for a dairy farmer. These cattle weren't bred for dairy, so they may not give as much as the others, but I think anything will help in the beginning, Pa said. I'm thrilled to have them, John said, washing his hands and sitting down just as Vicki put the bowls and fresh bread on the table. After a quick prayer, they tucked into the food, eating quickly. Pa and Roy each had 2 bowls, and when Vicki asked if they wanted more, they said they needed to get back. Thanks again to both of you, Vicki said. It was a very generous gift, and we appreciate it. Yes, we do, John said, standing to walk them to the door. Now that you have more cows, are you going to be too busy for your wife? John laughed. I could never be too busy for the most beautiful wife I have. Is that so? He nodded. Well, you sit right there while I do the dishes, and then we can play more newlywed games, as Pa calls them. Instead, I'm going to go milk the heifers they just brought. I know they didn't have time to do it after they got here. They sure were in a hurry. They didn't want to interrupt us, Vicki said with a smile. It's nice to have family members who try to support you in all you do. It sure is, John said. He kissed her quickly. Back after I get done milking. He came back 30 minutes later with a full pail of milk. There's good cream on this, he said. Do you want me to put it with the rest of the milk, or do you want to make it into butter? Oh, it's time for me to make butter for sure. You don't have a churn, do you? I'll make you one in the morning. Sounds good to me. I could use a few hours off from housework anyway. She wiped the last dish dry and put it into the cabinet. I love the cabinets you made me. I'm glad you find them handy, he said. They're wonderful. She stepped outside and looked at the road her pa and brother had left down. They're gone. Let's get naked. Sometimes I think you only love me for my body, John said, trying to sound annoyed. She laughed. No, but I do love your body. He frowned as he realized that she had yet to tell him she loved him. Why hadn't she said the words? She acted as if she loved him, which was good, but if she didn't say how she felt, how would he ever know? I love you, he said softly. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him. Thank you. She didn't know what else to say because she wasn't yet certain if she did love him. Nothing had clobbered her over the head and told her she loved him, so she couldn't say the words back. Not in good conscience anyway. Don't you love me? He asked, frowning at her. She sighed. I hoped this wouldn't come up until I was sure. I love your body. I love being married to you. I love our life together, but I'm not sure I love you. Hopefully, I'll be sure soon, but I don't want to say it until I'm absolutely certain. He gaped at her. You married me without loving me? I can't imagine my life with anyone else, so yes, I married you without loving you. I choose to stay with you, and if anyone has my heart, it's you. But I can't say the words until I'm sure. I don't even know how to react to that, he said, his face full of sadness. I'm going to take a walk. I'll come with you, Vicki said, ready to follow him anywhere. No, I think I'd rather be alone for a while. Vicki busied herself while he was gone, scrubbing the floor and washing down walls that hadn't been there long enough to be dirty. She wondered if she should have said she loved him, just to make him happy, but then she wouldn't have been true to herself. She'd made a vow to love and cherish him, and she was cherishing him, and she was working on loving him. Why wasn't that enough? She kept working, only realizing when she started to take the stove apart to clean it that he'd been gone much longer than he should have been. She stepped outside and called him as loudly as she could. John. She heard a muffled sound, and she followed it, around the house and into the construction area he called a barn. She found him buried under some boards. What happened? She asked, but there was no answer. She pulled the boards off of him one by one, not caring if they landed in a nice pile. Finally, she had him completely uncovered. Are you all right? She asked. His eyes opened and he blinked at her. Vicki? You've had some sort of accident, she said. I've got the boards off you. Can you walk? I don't know. He sat for a minute, trying to decide if there was pain. My head hurts, but that's all. Let me help you up, she said, worried that his head injury could be worse than they realized. I'm going to hitch up the team and drive you into town to see the doctor. He shook his head, realizing his mistake when it started hurting more. He put his hand to his head. No doctors. Just get me home. With her arm around his waist and his around her shoulders, they hobbled their way back to the house. Once she had him in bed, she asked, Are you sure I can't take you to see the doctor? I'm sure. I'm just glad you found me. Were you working on the barn when it was almost dark? She asked, thinking the man was a complete idiot for doing something so foolhardy. I was. I figured I could get some of my annoyance out by pounding nails. You scared me half to death. Don't you realize that you're the reason I get up in the mornings? You go out there and act the fool, and leave me here worried about you? I don't know what I'd do if I lost you. He stared at her for a moment, a slow smile crossing his face. You do love me, don't you? I don't know, she shouted. You tried to kill yourself before I could even figure it out. His smile turned into a full grin. Get me a cold rag for my head, would you? Now that he was certain she loved him, he didn't mind if she took some time to figure it out for herself. She got the rag and gently put it on his head, washing the blood away. What were you thinking? She asked. I was in here scrubbing an already clean house from top to bottom and you were outside building a barn without sufficient lighting. Even if you were mad at me, how was that at all constructive? He shrugged, and just kept grinning that silly grin. She was mad enough at the moment to slap it off his face. Stop grinning at me, you lunatic. He laughed. Come to bed with me, he said, catching her hand and pulling her down atop him. We can't do anything while you're too addle-brained to pay attention to anything I'm saying. It's my head I hurt, not my middle leg. I'm not risking any of you. You can wait till tomorrow. To slip inside you, he asked, pulling her down to sit beside him on the bed. Now it's all I can think about. How it feels when your body closes around me. How your nipples taste against my tongue. Make love with me, Vicki. She shook her head adamantly. I'll sleep in the bed with you, but nothing is going to happen tonight. I'm not risking losing you, so you can feel better. I love you, Vicki. She sighed. I love you too, you idiot. Next time leave off calling me an idiot, and I'll be so happy. Next time don't be an idiot. She curled up on the bed beside him, not removing any of her clothes for fear he'd talk her into something she shouldn't do. I was so worried. At that moment the dam broke, and she began to sob. I could have lost you. But you didn't. I'm fine. My head just hurts a little. It should with that giant lump on it. She sniffled again. Don't ever do that to me again. I won't. I promise you that. I do love you, John. Even though you're an idiot. Was that better? You could drop the word idiot completely, he said. Not for a while yet. She kissed his cheek. I need you. Epilogue. 3 years later, their herd of cattle had become too much for him to handle alone, and he'd had to hire a younger man to help him out. Vicki was expecting their second child, and she was so excited she could just burst. They had a little boy, who was named after John, but they called him Jack. Jack was an adorable child, and he filled her heart with gladness every day. John still had a small scar from his run-in with the barn, but he had suffered no long-term effects from his idiocy. Soon, she hoped to have daughters, whom she could tell about how wonderful a wedding night should be. They would love working in the garden, sewing, and cooking. At least she hoped they would. Jack certainly enjoyed helping her weed the garden, but mostly because it gave him time to play in the dirt. Hopefully, Barbara would find love soon. She'd like to see her sister happily married and having a family of her own. With as many wagon trains coming through as there were, she was sure to meet someone. Her life was perfect in her eyes, even though she'd long since realized her husband was not. John made her crazy at times, but she loved him with everything inside her. Love had been the real goal. Not marriage.